Welcome to a tutorial video on learning React. In this video, I'm going to talk about making classes. Now, I discussed in the previous video how we can make classes that extend the React component. And when we do, we basically create components in React. Then I repeated multiple times that components render. And we understood this complex relationship between rendering and components. That is, each component renders, and it's all based on the initial render coming from the React DOM object. Once it kicks off its render, anything it creates kicks off their renders, and so everything can render independent from each other because they're all components within an interface. Now, I also mentioned in the previous video how React initially works by looking at HTML it's given, and if it doesn't understand it, it goes looking for basically objects that match that name. And if it runs into it, it then calls their render functions. So we can start to add in our own HTML and have things react to that way, hence the name. So let's come back to this idea. Right here in the React DOM, using the render function, the very basis of everything we're doing. I've changed things up a little bit. In the previous example, this was just an example element, and it was self-closing. It had this self-close right here, and it wasn't really doing anything. But then I talked through how it matched the class example because it extends a React component and had a render function. This time I've added a new thing. It now has a property, an attribute, of name equals Dan. And notice this still looks like HTML. Well, whenever we're having the React DOM render something, whatever it renders has both a name and properties. When it is rendered and it calls an object, it creates that object. Not only is it creating it, but it's also sending in an initial value called props. Props stands for properties. So we can think of it then as not only this going and creating this example object and then calling its render, but also sending it any properties that are within that element itself. So in this case, we're sending it props, standing for properties, with name. In this case, name equals the value Dan. So I've extended out this code so we can look at this. This really isn't a very useful constructor, and in fact we'd probably get a warning about it. But it helps us to see what exactly is going on here. So the very first thing that's happening is when this object is being constructed, it's being passed in something called props. And then we're calling the parent, React component, and sending that same thing in. Which then means that this class now has an internal property called this.props. This.props is equal to anything that it was a property on the element that it's based on. So we have classes that are based on elements, and their properties are passed in as props, the value props here. So down here in line 19, name equals Dan. Then we know this .props .name will be equal to Dan. And we see that on line 13. So we're coming down here to render ran into example. It said, okay, this is a property name that equals Dan. It created this, invoked a constructor, sent in the value. We just made sure the parent had it. Then it came down for time to render, and then to return. Then we see our H1 we'll be using through all of these videos. My name is, and then something different. So what is up with these opening and closing curly brackets? Well, this is JSX, which is something particularly important and useful in React. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in another video. But the basic idea is that we can use this when we want the value of a variable or to call a function within some existing HTML. It basically says, hey, run this little chunk of JavaScript right within this greater chunk of HTML. So on line 13, we have what looks like HTML plus this opening and closing curly brackets around this.props.name. And as I mentioned, that will be Dan when it renders. And we know that because down here, it's a property. It was passed in as props. And we're saying this.props.name So whatever the property was, it will have this value. And in fact, if we jump over to a web browser, we see it right there. My name is Dan. And we refresh, we see the same thing. So coming back to this code then, we can start to understand we can make classes by, as I mentioned in the previous video, extending React component, creating more component classes, and then knowing that components render, working with the render functions to contain some bit of HTML. And we can also start to realize that if we want to pass information to these, we can put it within the properties of the elements we're rendering. When we render that element, not only will objects be created based on that name, if they exist, but also their properties will be transferred over, and so they can become things we can pass. So it looks like, sort of, we're taking one form of HTML, and anytime it runs into a new name, it's creating objects, calling their render functions, and their render functions are doing things. Again, coming back to this idea, if we have an interface composed of a number of different components, all of those components are doing their own things. Maybe they're refreshing content, maybe they're showing different things, but they're all acting independently. Coming back to this idea that we set this all up and then we let it go. So down here, render kicks all of this off. React DOM.render kicks all of this off. Anytime it runs into an object that has its own stuff, it creates that object, does whatever that object says to do, constructor or whatever, looks for that render function. The render function does something, in this case returning HTML, mixing a little bit of JSX, and we just build more and more complex projects based on this simple idea of making classes and understanding the render function. As long as we understand those, React isn't terribly complicated. It does some unique things, but it comes back to this idea of using JSX, understanding the render function, and making classes. Thanks for watching.